Imagine you're standing on the deck of a 14th century merchant ship. The air is perfectly still. Stagnant, really. The canvas sails above your head are heavy, damp with salt, and absolutely useless. You are trapped. Not by a storm, not by an enemy, but by the fundamental, maddening physics of moving against the wind. For centuries, this was the absolute ceiling of human ambition. You could go where the wind pushed you, sure, but you could never, ever go home if the wind decided otherwise. And honestly, that's a terrifying way to live. This isn't just about bad luck. It's about a wall, a physical, invisible wall of air. And the question we need to answer today is how a single, deceptively simple shift in ship design demolished that wall and forced the entire world to open up. To understand why this shift happened, you have to look past the romance of exploration and look at the ledger. Because in the 1400s, Portugal was an economic backwater. The Mediterranean spice trade was dominated by Venice and Genoa, who controlled the flow of goods through the Silk Road. If you were a Portuguese merchant, you were paying a massive markup on everything from pepper to silk, and you had no way to cut out the middlemen. They weren't looking for adventure, not really. They were looking for a route to the source. But the ocean was a locked room. The workhorse of the era was the cog. Think of a floating, heavy box. It was a sturdy, high-walled vessel built for the calm, reliable conditions of the Baltic. If you tried to sail a cog into the teeth of an Atlantic wind, it would just sit there, drifting backward, leaking cargo and morale. And here is where we find the first mechanical failure, the hull construction. These ships used clinker, or lapstrake construction. Think of it like shingles on a roof, where planks of wood overlap. It's strong, but in the water, it's a nightmare. Each of those overlapping edges creates a tiny, turbulent whirlpool of drag. It turns the hull into a friction machine. You are fighting the water as much as you are fighting the wind. The ship wasn't just a vessel, it was an anchor. So the engineers shifted. They abandoned the clinker method for Caravel construction. They laid the planks flush, edge to edge, and caulked the seams with oakum and pitch. The result was a smooth, hydrodynamic surface that slipped through the water rather than pushing it aside. But the hull was only half the equation. The medieval European ship relied on the square sail, essentially a parachute. It works best when the wind hits it directly from behind. It's a push mechanism. If the wind is coming from the direction you want to go, you are dead in the water. But then they integrated the lateen sail. This is a triangular sail, mounted on a long yard at an angle to the mast. It isn't a parachute, it's a wing. When the wind flows across that triangular surface, it creates lift. It's the same physics that keeps a 747 in the air. For the first time, sailors weren't just being pushed, they were navigating. They were working with the fluid dynamics of the air, not just fighting it. This combination, the smooth Caravel hull and the triangular lateen sail, created the Caravel. It was a masterpiece of small-scale engineering. It could close haul, meaning it could point its bow much closer to the direction the wind was coming from without stalling. This wasn't just a new boat, it was a new way of interacting with the planet. But there was still the psychological barrier. The Portuguese were terrified of the Green Sea of Darkness, that stretch of ocean south of Cape Bojador, off the coast of West Africa. Sailors believed the water boiled there. They believed that if you went too far south, you couldn't get back because the trade winds would never let you return. And with the old cog-style ships, they were right. The wind was a one-way ticket. So how did they beat the wind? They mastered tacking. Now, I need to back up for a second to explain why this is so strange. Tacking is the art of sailing in a zigzag pattern. You don't sail directly toward the wind. You sail at an angle to it, back and forth, like a pendulum. You're moving sideways, but you're slowly making progress forward. To the human brain, this feels like you're going in the wrong direction. Actually, wait, let me rephrase that. It feels like you're failing. You're sailing away from your goal to get closer to it. It's counterintuitive and requires a level of patience that, frankly, is exhausting. But this maneuver allowed the Caravel to turn the wind from a master into a tool. Once you understand the math of tacking, the ocean is no longer a barrier, it's a highway. And this didn't happen in a vacuum. If you head to Sagres in southern Portugal, you can see where this synthesis happened. Prince Henry the Navigator brought together cartographers, astronomers, shipbuilders from the Mediterranean, and Atlantic sailors. It was a proto-Silicon Valley. They built a feedback loop. A sailor would return with data, the cartographers would update the portalon charts, and the next voyage would be armed with better information. The Caravel was the physical output of that data. The result was swift. In a matter of decades, they bypassed the Sahara. They weren't stopped by the coast. They weren't stopped by the wind. They were moving down the African continent, mapping, trading, and fundamentally shrinking the world. You know, we usually think of the Caravel as the ship that discovered new worlds, but that is the romantic version. If you want to understand how it actually functioned in the 15th century, you have to stop thinking of it as an explorer's vessel. Think of it as an extraction unit. It was a precise, modular piece of machinery designed for one specific output, moving high-value commodities, gold, ivory, and human beings from the African coast back to the metropole. It wasn't built to explore. It was built to sustain a system of total control. And the most chilling part? It was so efficient at that job that it locked the world into a colonial model that lasted for centuries. Today, we're going to pull that system apart to see exactly how this boat defined the speed and scale of empire. On-scene setup. So let's actually step inside one of these things. Imagine you're off the coast of Guinea in 1450. You're on a Caravel, maybe 50 tons, barely 70 feet long. The first thing that hits you isn't the grandeur of the open sea, it's the smell. It is a suffocating mix of pine pitch used to caulk the hull, the sharp metallic tang of damp rigging, and the deep, rotting sweetness of salted meat festering in the hold. It's tight. Every square inch is optimized for storage. There is no wasted space on a ship this small. And the atmosphere? It's not heroic. It's claustrophobic. You have 20 men living on top of the cargo they are sent to retrieve. There is a persistent low-level anxiety, not just about the waves, but about the mission. You are deep in waters no one back home truly understands. You are entirely alone. The geopolitical context, breaking the monopoly. Now, to really understand why the Caravel mattered, you have to look at the map of 1450 with a different set of eyes. For centuries, the Mediterranean was the center of the world, and that world was controlled by a gatekeeper. If you wanted spices, silks, or gold from the east, you had to pay the tax. Venice held the keys to the Mediterranean trade routes, and behind them, the Ottoman Empire acted as a final, immovable wall. Every ounce of pepper that reached a London or Parisian kitchen table had been marked up 10, 20, even 50 times by the time it filtered through a dozen intermediaries. Portugal, perched on the edge of the Atlantic, was practically a backwater. They weren't fighting for glory, they were fighting for survival. They needed a back door to the wealth of the East. The Caravel was that key. It wasn't just a boat, it was a technological bypass. By mastering the wind patterns of the open Atlantic, the Volta do Mar, or the turn of the sea, the Portuguese realized they didn't need to hug the coast, and they certainly didn't need to pay the Venetian tariff. They could go around the problem. The Caravel turned the impassable Atlantic from a wall into a highway. Think about the Caravel compared to the Carrack, the heavy-duty leviathan of the era. The Carrack was a fortress. It was built for stability and massive storage, but it was slow, cumbersome, and drew too much water to explore the shallow estuaries of the African coast. If you tried to sail a Carrack up the Senegal River, you'd be grounded in 10 minutes. But the Caravel? It was the direct opposite. It was a shallow draft vessel. Its hull was designed for versatility. It could handle the brutal, unpredictable swells of the open Atlantic, but it could also slide into a shallow river delta to trade or extract. This dual capability was the secret weapon of empire. And the rigging? This is where the real brilliance lay. The Caravel utilized the lateen sail, a triangular rig borrowed from Islamic dhows in the Indian Ocean. Unlike the heavy, square-rigged ships of Northern Europe, which were slaves to the wind direction, the Caravel could tack or sail closer to the wind. It was agile. It could navigate against a headwind. For an empire builder, this meant predictable schedules. It meant you weren't waiting months for the trade winds to turn in your favor. You were in command of your own timeline. Life on a Caravel was a masterclass in endurance. You had a crew of roughly 20 men. The hierarchy was brutal. The captain, the pilot, the master, and the marineros who did the back-breaking labor. But the real psychological weight wasn't the hierarchy, it was the volta do mar. To catch the winds that would bring them home, sailors had to intentionally sail away from their destination, pushing deep into the open ocean, often losing sight of land for weeks. Imagine that in 1450. You aren't just navigating by compass, you're using the stars, the height of the sun, and a deep, intuitive understanding of currents. Every day out of sight of land was a gamble. You had to trust that the math was right. You had to trust that there was wind waiting for you on the other side of the arc. The anxiety on board was constant. If the pilot miscalculated by even a few degrees, you didn't just miss your port, you vanished into the Atlantic void. This was not a voyage for the faint of heart. It was a calculation of acceptable loss. Once they arrived, the mission was stark. This wasn't exploration for the sake of science. The Caravel was the delivery system for the first global extraction network. They would pull into a coastal outpost, anchor in the shallows, and wait. And the cargo? It wasn't just gold anymore. It was people. The Caravel's design made it the perfect vessel for the early slave trade. It was small enough to be easily managed by a small crew, but capable of carrying cargo that didn't need the comforts of luxury freight. This is where the engineering shifts from genius to horror. The holds were redesigned, the deck space was cleared, the same speed and efficiency that allowed Portugal to bypass the Ottoman trade blockade was now being applied to human lives. They moved with a terrifying, industrial precision. They would drop anchor, load up, and catch the currents back to the Azores or Lisbon. The Caravel didn't just carry cargo, it carried the logistical blueprint of what would become the transatlantic slave trade. It proved that you could move human beings across an ocean as if they were just another commodity on the manifest. Conclusion. You know, we often look back at the 15th century and see a map expanding, a world growing larger. But looking at the Caravel, the reality is the opposite. The world didn't get larger, it got tighter. It was squeezed by the capabilities of a hull that could navigate shallow rivers and ocean currents with equal ease. The Caravel turned the ocean from a barrier into a conduit for total exploitation. It was the precursor to the container ship, the prototype for the logistics networks we take for granted today. When we look at these ships in museums, we see polished wood and white sails. But we are looking at the foundational unit of a system that prioritized efficiency above all else. An efficiency that didn't just bridge continents, but ultimately tore them apart to feed the markets of Europe. The Caravel didn't just change how we sailed, it changed what we thought was acceptable to carry across the sea. Let's start with a puzzle. In the 14th century, merchant vessels like the Cog were effectively floating, heavy boxes designed for the calm, reliable waters of the Baltic. They were built with clinker construction, overlapping planks like roof shingles. While robust, this created massive water drag, turning the hull into a friction machine that barely crawled. Then came the Caravel. Engineers shifted to Caravel construction, laying planks flush, edge to edge. It turned the hull into a hydrodynamic surface, allowing the ship to glide rather than force water aside. But the real game changer was the lateen sail. Unlike the square sails of the north, which acted like parachutes demanding a tailwind, the triangular lateen functioned like an airplane wing. It used airflow to create lift. This enabled a revolutionary maneuver, tacking, sailing in a zigzag pattern against the wind. It turned the ocean from an impenetrable wall into a highway. This wasn't just a modification, it was a fundamental shift in how humanity engaged with fluid dynamics, collapsing the limitations of medieval trade and ushering in the age of exploration. But here's where it gets interesting. The very engineering that conquered the ocean for empires would eventually provide the keys to their greatest security crisis. The Caravel didn't just carry cargo, it carried the seeds of its own destruction. Staring out at the Atlantic in the 15th century, the horizon wasn't just distant, it was a wall. A Caravel, however, could slip through that wall. It was small, nimble, and deceptively simple. Unlike the massive, deep-drafted carracks, the floating warehouses of the era, the Caravel was a shallow draft machine. It could slide into river deltas, hide behind sandbars, and anchor in estuaries that would snap the keel of a Royal Navy warship. This access made it the perfect tool for colonial extraction, but it also made it the ultimate getaway vehicle. If you wanted to vanish, you didn't need a massive galleon. You needed a Caravel. By the 17th century, the world had changed. The era of privateering, where the crown paid sailors to raid enemy ships during wartime, came to a grinding halt with the signing of peace treaties. Thousands of sailors, once state-sanctioned heroes, were suddenly unemployed. Picture the docks of Port Royal, 1670. A captain named Thomas, who had spent years hunting Spanish treasure fleets, is suddenly handed his walking papers. His ship, his only source of income, is now legally useless. He is sitting in a tavern, nursing cheap rum, watching a merchantman loaded with sugar and spice lumbering out of the harbor. The math is brutal. He has the skills, he has the ship, and he has the knowledge of the coastline. Now, I need to back up a bit. He knows that the shallow draft ship he operates can hide in a lagoon where the heavy, bureaucratic Navy, with its rigid chain of command and slow-moving vessels, can never follow. Thomas isn't deciding to be a villain. He is deciding to survive using the only tools he has. The Caravel and its evolutionary successors, like the sloop, did more than just facilitate travel. They facilitated a new kind of social structure. On a massive British man-o-war, life was a brutal, top-down hierarchy. You were a cog in a machine ruled by the lash. But on a small, cramped pirate sloop, you couldn't afford to run a ship like that. You needed every man to be efficient, loyal, and fast. This necessitated a weirdly democratic, egalitarian system. They voted on where to sail. They split the booty with formulas that would make a modern accountant blush. The ship's architecture forced a social revolution. I mean, if you have 30 men on a 50-foot deck, you cannot treat them like slaves and expect them to fight for you in a storm. You have to treat them like stakeholders. And that is exactly what the pirates did. The colonial powers, conversely, were trapped in their own rigidity. They tried to impose law on the ocean using a blockade mentality. They would station massive, heavy warships at major choke points, assuming that if they controlled the ports, they controlled the flow of goods. But look, they were playing checkers while the outlaws were playing three-dimensional chess. The pirates, utilizing the speed and shallow draft capabilities of their ships, didn't bother trying to control the ports. They turned the geography of the ocean against the empires. They treated the vast, uncharted reefs of the Caribbean as their own private highway system, moving through spaces that were, for the Royal Navies, essentially invisible. The British and Spanish spent fortunes trying to hunt them down, but they were trying to catch wind with a net. The harder they pushed to secure the shipping lanes, the more the pirates exploited the gaps. The Caravel had effectively rendered the traditional naval blockade obsolete. It was a mathematical impossibility to patrol the entire Atlantic. Every time a governor sent a ship to hunt a pirate, that pirate simply used his draft to cross a sandbar, leaving the heavier hunter stranded. And this brings us back to the uncomfortable reality of the Atlantic in the 1600s. It wasn't a series of connected ports. It was an infinite, unpoliced wilderness. It was a vacuum of authority, and that vacuum was filled by the people who understood the machinery of the sea better than the people who claimed to own it. When we look at the history of these ships, we are looking at the birth of a shadow economy. We often romanticize the spirit of the pirate, but the reality was technological. They were simply the first people to understand that in a world of high-speed, long-distance trade, the ability to disappear is more valuable than the ability to fight. Innovation always has a dark side. The moment you build a faster, more capable vehicle, you have also built a faster, more capable tool for those who exist outside the law. And honestly, I'm not entirely sure the Golden Age of Piracy ever really ended. We swapped wood for steel and wind for diesel, but the fundamental friction of the ocean remains. Our global trade networks are more fragile than we admit, vulnerable to anyone who understands the terrain and knows how to use the speed of the modern world against the sluggishness of its regulators. The Caravel wasn't just a ship. It was the blueprint for a system of maritime power that still dictates our vulnerability today. The ocean is still vast. The ships are still fast. And the line between the explorer and the outlaw? It's just a matter of perspective.